Well, good morning, everybody. A very warm welcome to our webinar on the future of Arctic security. My name is Peter Jones. I'm a distinguished fellow at RUSI, and we're bringing this event to you in conjunction with our partners, the University of Iceland and British Embassy Reykjavik. So many thanks to them. For RUSI, this is part of a wider program looking at European security at a pivotal time, European security in transformation. And of course, currently eyes are very much on the east of the continent, but the north matters too. Security is always a 360-degree business, and perhaps regions are inseparable from one another. The north, the Arctic, certainly of great importance. There are a number of aspects to consider. We can think about the impact of climate change, both in terms of opening up opportunities in the Arctic and high north, and potentially the risks that come along with the opportunities. We think about the various fora that exist for cooperation and dialogue. Think about the threats that might be emerging and how we might mitigate those. Think about formats for countries, including the United Kingdom, to be engaged with its Nordic and other partners. So much to discuss. A word on the format for this session. In a moment, I'll invite some welcome remarks from Dr. Bryony Matthew, who's the British Ambassador to Iceland. And we will also have some introductory remarks, I'm very pleased to say, from the Foreign Minister of Iceland. After those welcome remarks, we will move into a session with our three panelists. I'll introduce those when we get to that session. They will each speak for about 10 minutes, and we will open up then to a discussion, and I will chair that conversation. There's an opportunity for you to pose questions as well. So if you use the Q&A function that you should see at the bottom of your screen, we will try and monitor those and pick up some of the questions and feed those into our three panelists in the second part of this session. In total, we'll run for 90 minutes, so we will close at 12:30 UK time. A reminder that this is on the record and we are recording it, and the session will be made available later on the RUSI website. So that said, I'm going to hand over to Bryony Matthews, the ambassador in Reykjavik, for some words of welcome. So Bryony, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning, everybody. So it's a real pleasure to welcome you all to this event today on the future of Arctic and High North security. We'd planned for it to be in person, but I'm very sorry that for COVID reasons, you can't all be here in Reykjavik and Iceland with us today. But you know, we're all used to online events, and I'm really pleased that we're still able to go ahead and hold this event virtually. Now, the Arctic and High North are areas of the world that have historically seen high levels of cooperation. A peaceful, stable, and well-governed Arctic is in all of our interests. However, climatic changes in the Arctic, along with technological advances, are making the region increasingly accessible for human activity. Now, this includes the exploitation of natural resources, it includes transport, fishing, and tourism. And now easier access to resources raises the potential for regional competition and conflict. The UK government recognises that climatic changes, together with geopolitical changes, could create security implications in the future. And that is why we wanted to hold this event today. This is an opportunity for us to discuss what the future risks are and how tensions in the Arctic and High North could be managed. It's an opportunity to discuss current frameworks for cooperation on Arctic security and to explore whether increased cooperation is needed and what that could look like. So let me take this opportunity to thank RUSI for everything they've done to organise and put together this event today, and also to thank the University of Iceland for their great collaboration. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the Foreign Minister of Iceland, Þórdís Gylfadóttir, who has very kindly provided some opening remarks for today's event. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, good morning. I would like to start by telling you how much I value this opportunity to say a few words on Arctic security. My sincere thanks to RUSI, to the British Embassy in Reykjavik, and to the University of Iceland for organizing this event. We welcome this discussion and the increased focus on the Arctic region, as the Arctic is a key foreign policy priority for Iceland. There are a few main reasons why we should be talking more about Arctic security. From my perspective as Minister for Foreign Affairs, I would like to emphasize three. First, the development in the Arctic region have ramifications on both sides of the Atlantic. Transatlantic security is the backbone of European security, and the security environment in the Arctic has clearly changed in recent years. Second, the higher the Arctic is on our radar, the more we deepen our understanding and strengthen our situational awareness, and the more likely it is that our nations can influence developments there. With the opening of Arctic shipping routes and increased access to natural resources, our interests are broader than ever: environmental, scientific, economic, and social. Which brings me to the third reason we should be talking more about Arctic security: the geopolitical implications. The increased Russian military activities and capabilities in the region give good reasons to keep the matters of the Arctic high on our list of priorities and maintain full attention on their developments. The level of Russian military buildup reflects the increased strategic importance of the Arctic in Russian military planning. We must also be mindful of the security implications and possible dual use of the activities of third actors in the Arctic and of strategic and tactical investments in the area. Dear guests, looking ahead, it will be important to maintain the balance between cooperation, such as in the Arctic Council, and the security considerations. Iceland, like all Arctic states, wants to keep the Arctic an area of peaceful cooperation, governed by international law, and respect for the sovereignty of the Arctic states. Given the growing geostrategic importance of the area, it will be important to improve our situational awareness and stay clear-eyed on any developments that may affect our shared security. Here, regional cooperation will play an increasingly important role. The focus of GEF on sub-threshold activities is relevant and will add value to our shared situational awareness. NATO's area of responsibility extends to the High North, and the alliance therefore maintains robust focus on the region. Other regional fora, such as NORDEFCO and the Northern Group, have intensified their cooperation. Our allies and partners have considerably increased their military budget, reviewed their Arctic policy documents, and adapted their posture and activities in the northern region. Increased activities at the Keflavik Air Base are a clear example of the level of attention that Iceland, our allies and partners, are paying to the North Atlantic and the Arctic region. With the recent build-up of the Russian military in and around Ukraine, it is clear that Europe and North America need to review policies and threat assessments. The risk of military conflict in Europe is real. We strongly support ongoing diplomatic efforts with Russia on Ukraine. We are worried about developments and are mindful of the need for solidarity between allies and like-minded countries when it comes to responses to any further transgressions by Russia. Even though all our attention is now on Russia and Ukraine, we must stay vigilant also in the Arctic. We firmly believe that the best way for the Arctic to remain a peaceful, low-tension area governed by international law is through multilateral collaboration and dialogue. And to that effect, we need to maintain constructive regional and international cooperation and be open to dialogue with Russia. I welcome the challenging questions to our experts today on the future of Arctic security, which can help us guide the way and focus our approach on this topic. Thank you.
So thank you so much to the Minister and to the Ambassador for those words of welcome and setting the scene really for the rest of this discussion. So now I'm going to introduce the three members of our panel who will speak in order. First of all will be Professor Caroline Kennedy-Pipe, who is Professor of War Studies at Loughborough University in the UK. Second will be Thomas Jarmalavičius, Head of Studies at the International Centre for Defence and Security in Estonia. And third will be Pierre Hansen, who is Director of the Institute of International Affairs at the University of Iceland, one of the co-hosts and sponsors for this event. So they will each speak for about 10 minutes or so, and then we will open it up for a conversation, including bringing in your questions from the Q&A box. So if I could turn, first of all, to Caroline, please. Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you to RUSI, the University of Iceland and the British Embassy in Iceland for organising this event. To follow what has just been articulated, the Arctic, of course, is not a place apart from global politics. For many who remember, indeed lived through the Cold War, we were keenly aware that the Arctic was a site of contestation between East and West, not least in terms of nuclear weaponry, nuclear deterrence, and the manner in which the Cold War literally played out in the frozen high north. We also need to be keenly aware that the Arctic is a peopled landscape. Security matters not just in hard terms, but in economic and soft security issues. And of course, it's not a pristine place in the sense that as the sea ice melts, we will become increasingly aware of environmental challenges, which could see climate refugees in the Arctic. It will also shape and frame military and diplomatic activities, and not least we're aware of a host of new actors entering the Arctic arena, not least China, which I'm sure we will come back to, but players like India, South Korea, and of course Turkey. And one of the requirements to become not an Arctic state, but certainly an Arctic stakeholder, is scientific credentials, which we in the UK have played a leading role on. But we're keenly aware, of course, that as science advances and is necessary to manage and survey climate change, there is also the dual use of technologies. And the Arctic itself is subject to remilitarization, if we can call it that, by a number of actors. And we've seen, as my colleague Duncan DePledge has articulated in a crucial article, the uptake in military activities on all sides. The key question is there a tension between the security architecture which has been developed in the Arctic, the sterling work done by the Arctic Council to maintain the Arctic as a place, some would say, of harmony and low tension, and is it now sufficient to depend on the Arctic Council as that key arena for dialogue? All this has to be set against, as we've just heard, against Russian activities, not just in the Arctic, and the Arctic is not a place apart, but in Ukraine, in Syria. And of course, Russia has legitimate security interests in and across the Arctic. And perhaps one of the lessons from the study of post-Cold War politics is that we ignored Russia, Russia's feelings, Russia's emotions about the reach, the creep of NATO into its sphere of influence, if we can call it that. And the question there is how to manage the Russian view of Western incursion into its backyard. And here, of course, Russia's remilitarization in the European Arctic, the non-linear development that we will see in its use of drone technologies, for example, across hazardous places, raises all sorts of security concerns, not just to Western allies, but to the people of the Arctic. Now, is there a new great game opening up in the Arctic, which will see Russian ambition twinning with its economic desire to exploit the resources of the Arctic through its cooperation with China? And how do we in the West manage this type of growing tensions? One of the issues, it seems to me, is that we don't talk in the same terms as the Russians. They have a very different view of sovereign rights as opposed to our view of sovereignty. And there is an emphasis, of course, on the recreation of this notion of the near abroad, that is, Russian-speaking peoples outside the borders of Russia itself. So I think that there's an issue of language and there's an issue of intent. What we also have, of course, in the UK is a medium-sized power albeit a full spectrum military power. How do we, as a leading member of NATO, reassure smaller allies in the shadow of Russia and subject to Russian mischief-making and incursion in the so-called grey zone? So hard military capabilities are one thing, but we're all keenly aware of Russia meddling in democratic elections, the way that social media is used to promote unrest in these populations, and how smaller states can accommodate themselves to this type of activity. Now, what I would argue is that we have a long history of managing tensions in the Arctic. We need only go back to the Cold War and think of the management, the balancing of nuclear deterrence. Think about the dialogue that we had in the 1980s about environmental risk in the Arctic. Mikhail Gorbachev's famous Murmansk speech, and all these multiple ideas for reducing military tensions in the Arctic. And I'm wondering if that is something we need to return to. And of course, the thorny issue is how we can possibly talk directly to the Russians and not feel mistrustful of intent. And that's a matter for diplomacy. Now, Russia's flaunting of international norms and sovereignty elsewhere lead to a degree of suspicion, a high degree of suspicion on what its intentions might be in the Arctic. But it appears far more likely to me that a crisis elsewhere will spill over into the Arctic. And the Arctic has never been immune. If we think back to all the wars that have taken place in Europe since Napoleon, to involvement and engagement, to being, because of its geostrategic location at the top of the world, to be both access and supply routes for European wars. So I think what we have is a security dilemma in the Arctic between Western powers and Russia itself, with the complexity of a China. And thus far, we've seen China economically probing Iceland, Greenland, looking for resources, looking for access, but thus far, no military threat. So we need to consider how and why that might change. What we also have is, of course, a marked increase in the Chinese presence in the Arctic, and of course, scientific credentials, research stations in Iceland and at Svalbard, and 2 commercial research icebreakers. And the Americans are behind, of course, in terms of icebreaker capability. The Chinese military threat, therefore, we cannot be complacent, but it's minimal at present. Its interests in the Arctic represent logical national interests. And again, if we think of the Arctic just simply north and south, I think we're missing this whole transpolar arena in the Arctic. So Duncan and I talk about a wider north as well as a high north. And I know Thomas is the expert on this, so I'll leave it. But I think thinking of the wider north, which includes the Baltics, as well as the European Atlantic, gives us a rather different perspective on the responsibilities that we have to friends and partners. Our increasing domain awareness, I think, is matched by a keen concern over what climate crisis will do in and around the Arctic. What occurred in the summer of 2020, the wildfires, the accelerated ILOS, indicate more rapid change than we had previously anticipated. And the consequences for human security, governance, and defense threatens health and food security across the Arctic and beyond. So the challenges of how friends and allies balance against the Russia threat. And here, there's a tightrope that has to be walked by some of our smaller states, which is to be key members and friends of NATO, but not antagonize the Russians. And this takes careful diplomacy, not careless diplomacy. I also think that there's an issue here between what political and military elites might want in the Arctic. And Denmark would be a clear case of using its position in NATO to prove itself a very worthy ally of the United States. But there's a question here which I think pertains particularly to Iceland, a key founding member of NATO, but also with a heavily anti-military population. So where do the people of the Arctic stand in all of our considerations? How will their sentiments be fed into state planning? And we've seen recently in Norway, of course, a shift to the left. So how is it going to be possible for the UK not to intrude, not to try and dictate what happens in the Arctic? That would be impossible, but to use, I think, mechanisms like the GEF, in which we lead, which is agile, which speaks to both NATO and EU states. Perhaps that's our role, to support, to listen, but also lead on these key issues such as GEF. So I think that's my 10 minutes, Peter.
That was very punctually to time, Caroline. Thank you so much. Much to ponder there. And thank you also for queuing in, to some extent, Thomas, on this issue of the wider North. So, Thomas, could I turn to you next, please?
Yes, thank you, Peter, and good morning, everyone. I am very grateful for the invitation, and it's a great honor and privilege to be able to speak in this event. And of course, why the Baltics? You know, we when it comes to discussing the Arctic, indeed we are near Arctic states, and jokingly we say that the measure of your Arctiness is whether you get to see Aurora Borealis or Northern Lights in your country. And just last week, we observed a spectacular show of Northern Lights as far as south as Lithuania. So here we are, geographically very close, and Estonia is actually the northernmost non-Arctic state. But for too long, we've been somewhat mentally distant until we realized that, some of my colleagues in the Baltic states put it, that what happens in the high north does not really stay there. And I would like to highlight why is that so, and how the Baltic states think of themselves in relation to high north. Indeed, so there is a very significant exposure to the developments in the Arctic due to a number of factors, and of course, the global effects of climate change spring first to mind, which they materialize in the Arctic at the double speed compared to the rest of the world, and is also affecting the climate in the weather conditions in the Baltic area. We have more frequent weather extremities. We see a growing risk of water stress, ecosystems change, coastal erosion due to the rising sea levels. All this kind of concentrates the minds, on the Arctic as well, because this is where it happens, happening fastest. Needless to say, Russia's military activities and push up in the north matter to us a lot. For Russia, the Baltic Sea region, the North Atlantic and western parts of the Arctic, these are all interconnected sub-theaters in one large strategic theater. And we even see, Northern Fleet routinely reinforcing the Baltic Fleet. We see how Zapad exercises conducted by Russia extend all the way up to the units in the north. And we realize, of course, that countering aggression against the Baltic states would rely a lot on reinforcements across the North Atlantic, making the defense of the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap and protection of undersea cables in the North Atlantic major strategic considerations for the Baltic states. So three Baltic states, in a way, sit in this overlap of eastern and northern flanks of the alliance, and they have to factor in the challenges to both of those flanks. And we also recognize that various negative developments in the high north would affect our Nordic neighbors, as well as key NATO allies such as United States, Canada, United Kingdom, and therefore would reverberate to our corner of Europe. We have very strong economic ties with the Nordics, extremely interconnected with the Nordics. So if they get into trouble in the Arctic, we are bound to suffer too. We have very close security and military ties with the Arctic and near Arctic states. NATO enhanced forward presence battle group in Estonia is led by UK with rotational Danish contribution and Icelandic participation, I must say. Also in Latvia, it is led by Canada, another Arctic nation, and in Lithuania, Norway is part of the mix. Also, Denmark is a framework nation for Multinational Division North, headquartered in Latvia. So there are concerns, of course, that any intensifying confrontations in the High North may divert resources and attention away from the Baltic area, or even split and divide the allies themselves. Also, not the least of the concern is that China is becoming increasingly present. It is pursuing new opportunities in the High North, with its Polar Silk Road initiative. It is increasingly present. It seeks access to mineral resources, many of which are actually crucial to the aspirations of the European technological sovereignty as well. It promotes infrastructure projects that could have high economic rewards, but also come with fairly high security risks to us, example due to espionage and economic coercion potential. Of course, there are opportunities related to that, related to connectivity via the Arctic to Asia. We are in the process of constructing Rail Baltic fast rail connection, which, if extended via tunnel to Helsinki and via Finnish railway network all the way to Kirkenes, Norway, would grant us access to North Sea route. So it's not only just threats, but also opportunities. And as I already mentioned, resources, it is worth noting that for the Baltic states, energy security considerations also apply. The LNG terminal in Lithuania that serves the markets in all three Baltic states receive supplies from the plant in Yamal Peninsula in Russia and also from the Norwegian sources. So disruption would be painful given how much we rely on LNG to balance out Gazprom's dominance. There's also human security dimension and human security challenges. Estonia in particular has affinity to Finno-Ugric nations across the Arctic. And the questions of human rights and freedoms and preservation of culture, particularly in discussions with Russia, are important aspects of this. And last but not least, of course, we have the issue of protection of international norms and rules that the small states rely so heavily upon in ensuring their security and prosperity. So anything that hinges on those in the Arctic would be of concern. In a way, the Baltic states have not been novices to and ignorant about the Arctic issues. There are regional, unilateral, cooperative frameworks involving the Baltic states, such as the Nordic Baltic 8, NORDEFCO cooperation, Northern Group, Council of Baltic Sea States. These all provide ample opportunities to take part in the discussions on the developments in the Arctic, even if only in the margins of those formats. And for instance, the Council for Baltic Sea States is part of the regular meetings of the four councils of the North, together with the Arctic, Barents Euro-Arctic, and Nordic Council of Ministers, which I think held the last meeting in 2020. So obviously, we also need to present our views in the EU and NATO if and when the High North is discussed at the table. Where in particular NATO's 360 degrees approach is giving additional impetus to paying closer attention to a Higher North. So now all three Baltic states have begun showing more active interest, encouraging the research and policy analysis related to High North. And Estonia applied for the observer status in the Arctic Council in late 2020, not successfully yet, and with Latvia due to follow suit in 2022. So this would strengthen their visibility and provide the opportunities for building relations with the members of this council. And this also has prompted us to consider what they could actually contribute to the cooperative framework that deliberately excludes hard security. Scientific expertise, for instance, in the environmental, atmospheric sciences, in biology, glaciology, marine systems research, social anthropology. Estonia has accumulated respectable polar expertise and has a very long tradition stretching back to the times of Frederick von Wrangel and Karl Ernst von Baer, which it fears it will lose soon without getting involved in the Arctic research networks, especially as Russia has become very difficult to access. And due to Finno-Ugric connections, Estonia also has very extensive interdisciplinary research on Siberian people that also provides data on adaptation to an impact of climate change, and also holds the largest genes database of the Siberian peoples in the world. There's also significant technical expertise in building smart solutions for maritime environment monitoring, for navigation in difficult conditions, for digital connectivity and cybersecurity, and involves excellence in robotics, sensorics, artificial intelligence, big data applications, even space technology. In any case, the Baltics understand that they can influence the developments in the High North only in an indirect and fairly minor way. Of course, they're doing their part in decarbonization and energy transition. They're doing their part in maintaining security and stability in the Baltic area, so that, for instance, in enhancing military interoperability with the Nordics, with the UK, with the United States. When it comes to the UK, of course, the JEF is of paramount importance. But still, we need to concentrate a lot of our attention in the eastern direction, managing external threats, and we remain preponderantly coastal rather than maritime nations. So we have limited military resources that can be dedicated to military cooperation and exercises in the High North. Of course, we're all free to participate, for instance, this year in the upcoming Cold Response 2022 exercise, but this contribution is likely to be quite modest, just as it was the case with the Trident Juncture 2018, which was the largest NATO exercise since the end of the Cold War and took place in Norway. And last but not least, even with this new attention to the High North and practical efforts to weave it into this wider North framework, sometimes we do not reflect it well enough in our own policies and strategies. For instance, Estonian Foreign Policy Strategy 2030, adopted the same year when launching its Arctic Council observer status bid, mentions Africa 10 times and the Arctic 0 times. And none of the three Baltic states has a dedicated Arctic policy or strategy document, and the Estonian Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee has recently strongly urged to draft one. In any case, the Baltics increasingly feel the need to get proactively involved, participate, and contribute to the Arctic agenda. And this is very quickly turning from a niche preoccupation among some enthusiasts into really policy mainstream thinking. And hopefully the allies and partners in that wider North will appreciate that the Baltics can and do play a constructive role in managing hard and soft security challenges in this vast region. Still, there is much more focus in our thinking on this wider than a High North focus, and the High North perspective can easily lose if its momentum, if not maintained. And I do hope that our policy establishments in the Baltic states will not get distracted from the strategic imperatives for the Baltic activism in this direction. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you ever so much. Lots there to ponder as well. So finally, for our three panelists, I'm going to turn to Pierre Hansen. So Pierre, over to you, please.
Thank you so much. Let me also thank the hosts and our contributors, our collaborators in this event. I've learned a lot so far and hope that a few comments and perspectives from Iceland will also be something of use to the dialogue to continue. So I'm delighted to participate. I'm here on behalf of the Institute of International Affairs at the University of Iceland. We have three different centers, and I believe that our involvement is mainly due to one of them being the Center for Arctic Studies. With the increased interest in the Arctic internationally, growing by the minute as we all witness climate changing, not only in the Arctic, of course, but globally, the effects are nonetheless felt on a deeper level here in the High North. So at the same time as policymakers have started to take Arctic affairs quite seriously, the focus of security has been extended to the Arctic. My remarks will mainly be devoted to discussing specifically the case of Iceland, a small island state in the middle of the Arctic that does not have a military, and trying to shed some light on the way in which Arctic security affects Iceland, its foreign policies, and relations with other states. As an Arctic state, it is, of course, of utmost importance for Iceland to maintain peace and security in the Arctic, particularly in light of the increased attention the region has been receiving from great powers. There is, of course, great concern in Iceland, like in most parts of the region, on possible spillover effects should the situation in the Ukraine continue to deteriorate. Strengthening the Arctic Council is of vital importance, as it provides a forum for dialogue with Russia in a non-military domain. And maintaining open communication lines can become increasingly important in the near future. All stakeholders have agreed that maintaining peace in the Arctic is a common goal that everyone in the region shares, but tension is nonetheless rising. There are reports of increased submarine traffic and overflights in Iceland, and of course reports on increased activities further in the Arctic region. To many in Iceland, the regained attention from the US for the Keflavik base is perhaps a sweet deal, especially to those that felt the US departure from the base in 2006 as a betrayal to a loyal partner. And although the US is not permanently back Cold War style, the US is nonetheless back. It is also worth exploring that even though increased interest in the region is taking place between opposing powers, Iceland has managed to maintain relatively good relations with each of them. But let me also add, from the perspective of a small state without a military, although a NATO member, I should add, that focusing merely on military issues and defense mechanisms is a rather narrow interpretation of security. Security is not defined in Iceland's national security policy. However, it states that the policy extends to global, societal, and military risks and entails active foreign affairs policy, civil security, and defense cooperation with other countries. It can therefore be argued that the Icelandic government focuses on security in a broad sense. Iceland remains ambiguous, however, about the renewed great power interest in the Arctic region. On the one hand, the Icelandic government is hopeful about the economic gains that could be generated via the opening of Arctic shipping lanes. On the other, the government has expressed concerns about the region's further militarization and its security implications, as expressed in Iceland's national security policy. And that certainly echoes with what our foreign minister just expressed in her presentation. To this end, Iceland is aware of its increased responsibility in search and rescue operations in the region, as well as emergency prevention, preparedness, and response. The area for which the Icelandic Coast Guard is responsible is vast, an area of 1.9 million square kilometers. The expansiveness of the area, among other factors, makes the Icelandic Coast Guard's reaction capability assessed as unsatisfactory. To ensure Iceland's security in the Arctic and enhance Iceland's reaction capability, it is imperative to provide the Coast Guard with the necessary funding. Indeed, increased marine traffic and marine activities in general within the Arctic creates a threat to marine security and hopefully gives rise to stronger cooperation between the Arctic states. The overarching threat is, of course, however, climate change, a global threat that we need to address holistically. Climate change is also an issue that has attracted greater attention from greater powers such as China and other Asian states due to the potential effects climate change may have on Asia. So we need to consider what effects climate change may have on people in the Arctic, and thus consider sustainable solutions to our livelihoods, including, of course, tourism and business. On the international level, Iceland has found itself navigating delicate waters between great powers in the Arctic, namely the US, China, and Russia, and is perhaps trying to find its niche as a peace broker in the Arctic. On the regional level, Iceland is an active participant in Arctic politics and increasingly in discussions on Arctic security. On the national level, however, Iceland will continue to enhance its Iceland-US security cooperation, as well as closer cooperation with the other Nordic countries. I will actually leave it at that because I think we do have a lot of fodder for discussion, and thank you all for your attention.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you to all three of you. So we will now move into the phase of our three panelists forming a discussion panel. Thank you for the questions that have been coming in the Q&A box, and I will come to those in a minute. I also have some questions I want to pick out from what's been said so far, but actually I'm going to start with one question that is in the Q&A, which is around terminology and definition. So We've already had a bit of a conversation around high north and wider north, but there's a question in the chat about how the panelists would understand the terms high north and Arctic in relation to one another. I mean, how what distinction you would see. So could I throw that open to the three of you? How would you define and use those terms, high north and Arctic? I don't know who'd like to go first. Pierre lives in the high north or Arctic, so go on, Pierre first.
Let's just say that defining the Arctic region is, of course, something that's also still up for grabs in so many ways. Iceland, of course, intends to define the Arctic region in a different manner, trying to, of course, secure our position in a sense, wanting to be considered a coastal state. Although, and you, of course, know the history behind all this, being included in the dialogue at all times and not just having the 5 coastal states discussing issues that Iceland feels is very pertinent to us. Also because the definition used here in Iceland is that we are wholly within the Arctic region, the only sovereign state that is wholly within the Arctic region. And so this is something that's of contention. But then discussing the Arctic versus high north, I think it kind of depends on probably, I believe that hearing mostly about the high north is something that I've heard mostly from Norway and from other actors there. So it's a little bit of, it's something that got chosen at some point and probably became the norm. But here we talk more about the Arctic, I would say, than the high north. Some might define the high north as being a larger area, though. I leave that up to Caroline and Thomas to discuss.
Well, I think if I can just jump in there, and people know better than I, the Arctic is a Greek word which was imposed anyway, wasn't it? So in the sense of, in terms of terminologies, I tend to regard the Arctic as the 8 Arctic states plus. But what Duncan and I were trying to do in our formulation of a wider north, and this is highly political, of course, is to point to the interconnections in security between the Baltic states running across through Greenland, UK, Iceland gap. So we were trying to, I think, point to the complexities of the political as well as the security and geographic, of course, geopolitics of the region. But I think Becca Pincus, who's at the US Naval War College, has also done us a great service by opening up this idea of the Arctic to the transpolar Arctic, to the way that we reconceptualize a region that stretches across the geography, pointing into the Indo-Pacific. And so there are many different Arctics. And I think we're highly politicized in the way that we categorize them. So I think in terms of geographic imagination, there are many different Arctics that we tend to define to suit our national purposes or our political intent. But certainly in terms of the wider Arctic, Duncan and I were attempting to look at a new architecture for understanding how it's all connected. But to stress, I do think Rebecca Pincus's definition pointing to the Indo-Pacific is also a very useful vision of how the world interconnects from China across.
Thanks, Thomas.
Yes, indeed, very interesting. I like this, as Caroline said, the geographical imagination, which of course has a political function as well. And in the Baltic debate, we usually use the word Arctic, but that has certain exclusivity to it. That since we are not the Arctic coastal states, or we're not beyond the Arctic Circle, then it becomes kind of a bit we do not have this sense that it is so close. But when you have this high north, and then you can really stretch it, to as much to the south as the northern lights shine. If you transpose, the Baltics, for instance, to North America, we're somewhere, in the central part of Hudson Bay. Is that high enough, or is that to be counted as high north countries, in the Norwegian thinking? But also the wider north concept is gaining traction, not least because it gives us opportunities to cooperate and connect, think along with the Nordic partners and the UK, and even to, if you look at the JEF membership, countries like the Netherlands, So it's indeed, you know, more flexible and perhaps reflects better the cooperative security networks and integration networks that are emerging. So the you know, in a strategic sense, the wider North for us probably makes more sense.
Thank you very much. So I just want to pose a couple of questions to the panel that came to me from your remarks, and then I will turn to the Q&A. The first was actually a question that Caroline posed earlier on, which was around, is there a new great game going on in this region? And I guess that's historically a reference to the great game between the British and Russian empires in Central Asia, you know, contest for influence and you know, economic access and so on. So if we think about the Arctic or the High North, clearly we have a recent history of sometimes, you know, greater tension, other times more cooperation. How would you each characterize the situation at the moment in terms of great power involvement? And what do you see the trajectory as? So let me throw that open. I mean, Caroline, you posed the question. Do you want to answer it?
Well, I posed a question that perhaps I need to hear answers to. It's very interesting, I think, how our attention shifted away from Russia at the end of the Cold War, that we tended to disregard the Russian insecurities and perceptions of the movement of NATO up, creeping right up, as I said, through Central and Eastern Europe. And so what we're seeing, I think, is a return of Russia under Mr. Putin from 2008 on, a growing assertiveness against Western interests. And in that sense, there is a game being played, which is for Russia, not simply in the Arctic, which of course it guards its Northern Sea route very jealously. But I think Russia's insecurities and the way that the Arctic is used to play to Mr. Putin's popularity, it's a nationalist cause, it has deep cultural links. We come back to that word of, you know, imagining the Russian Arctic. And of course, the Russian Arctic is fragile in so many respects, not just environmentally, but in terms of demography, in terms of gender balance, and in terms of the social ills which dog the Russian Arctic. But it's not separate from Russian reassertion, Belarus, Ukraine. So I see it as tied into a far more ambitious Russian foreign policy emerging out of the 1990s. And in that respect, under President Biden, started under Mr. Trump, there is a growing American interest, of course, itself a great Arctic state. The Canadians too, new security policies. So I do see that America, Russia, increasingly Canada, which is of course in dispute with the United States over the Northwest Passage, there are a series of issues and tensions which are beginning to grow. But for Russia, I don't think that they are disconnected from global politics. And of course, throw into the mix China, increasingly assertive and ambitious. And I think you do see those great powers, plus a mix of medium-sized powers, and of course the smaller states, all being drawn into a new set of challenges. Now, that's not to say there isn't cooperation. Search and rescue is an obvious one where there's a great deal of cooperation. You know, the Arctic is not a lawless place. The UN law of the sea operates, although the Americans haven't signed up to it. There are cooperative measures across the Arctic, but there's no doubt that there's a new set of tensions, and it's not the Wild West, but the economic riches of the Arctic. We would have to think about who owns and who will access. And of course, nobody owns the high seas and the oceans. And that's another problem. And I should just throw into the mix that, of course, in the skies above the Arctic, of course, there is a battle over controlled space and satellites. So it's a very complex environment.
Thank you. The others, would you like to come in on this one? Thomas.
Well, just very quickly, you know, if you think of power as the outcome, or the measure power by the ability to shape the outcomes processes in certain political space or geographical space. Certainly, you know, there are countries in the Arctic and the high north that, you know, on the global scale might not be regarded as great powers, but they're certainly great powers in the Arctic. Canada was mentioned for one, and Norway can certainly, you know, do a punch above its weight when it comes to shaping the outcomes of processes up there. The UK is weighing in, although it's sort of you know, there's a discussion now whether it's still a great power or is it a medium-sized power, you know, globally. And China wading in. I'm always cautious of those, you know, parallels, whether it's kind of great game of the, you know, 19th century type thing. You know, this historical parallels not necessarily work. And even those countries that have a claim to a great power status globally might actually struggle to really fulfill their ambition. And if you're looking at the Russian ambitions, there's obviously a certain gap between what they will be able to achieve because the geographical area is massive, their resources are still limited, and despite all these ambitions to invest in the Arctic and so on, they will probably struggle a lot to reach their targets. So is that you know, the great powers fate that, you know, you're still falling short of ambitions, you know? So you know, in that regard, I would be quite cautious, but certainly the tensions will be there. These insecurities are much greater. That's probably one of the things to be careful about, the insecurities of each other's, and when those insecurities translate into kind of passive aggressive, you know, behavior, then they cause certainly a lot of troubles, and so some social insecurities, you know, even lead to the comical episodes that we saw with U.S. You know, former President Trump's suggestion to buy Greenland from Denmark. I mean, this is quite ridiculous, but you know, just reflects that some countries might feel insecure because of really stupid comments even thrown in that direction. And therefore we have to be very careful. It still remains a very fragile geopolitically environment, not only in terms of environments. Thank you.
Yeah, let me just basically chime in on the same notes. I very much like the way you articulated this, Caroline, because there are certainly things that we are concerned about here in the region when things are happening other places in the world with potential spillover effects, of course. Also, whatever effects we have from climate change, those are the main threats that we see now. And then what other kinds of things can happen? Let's, for example, envision, although not a pleasant thought, that something serious would happen with a cruise liner, and we would all then have to scramble to try to do what we can to rescue people in a very difficult situation. These are the kind of concerns that Iceland certainly has, and whatever else is going on with global security these days, of course, we're not just an island here. We're all interconnected. So whatever is going on in the world is going to be of great concern here. And that certainly goes for small states everywhere when the big powers are rubbing up against each other in this kind of a manner. So we need to strengthen the dialogue, of course. And I think it's extremely important that we pay attention to the forums that we do have, where actually people can sit down and talk, to keeping those communication lines open. I like that whole idea, and also trying to think about what was actually well done in the Cold War. Can we return to that to some extent, like you mentioned as well, Caroline? You know, can we find something in the toolbox that will assist us in this situation?
Well, and just to jump in, of course, President Trump was not the first American president to try and buy Greenland. President Truman, at the very start of the Cold War, saw its strategic importance and made a similar offer. But I think those legacies, if you like, persist in the sense of what does sovereignty mean in the sense of the Danish kingdom. We see rising tides of calls for independence. And so that whole history, I think, is playing out in terms of Greenland. And I should also just add in there, you know, it is curious to me and something of a puzzle, although it shouldn't be, that Turkey, of course, is burnishing its polar credentials. again, in terms of the Anthropocene, glacier, melt, climate change. So there are many actors. Perhaps I'm wrong to use imperial terms like the Great Game, forgive me, but I do think there are many actors who see this arena. And also, of course, the South Pole is not going to remain a zone of harmony. So I think we're looking at polar politics, where many states are extremely engaged and want to be increasingly so.
Very good point to wrap up that bit of the conversation. Now, we've got lots of Q&As, questions coming in on the Q&A.